Hello, happy Thursday. We are going to do today the recap for the WSET Diploma D4 Sparkling Wines and D5 Fortified Wines that were released from the exam that a lot of folks took just a couple days ago. WSET's really good about releasing the exam wines. Unfortunately, though, you have to wait like 3 months to get your scores for the exam. So for those of you that took the exam, take a deep breath. Make sure you're drinking something good, recover, and honestly, don't even think about your score. It's so easy to second guess yourself. Oh, I should have answered this on theory. Oh, I should have guessed this on blind tasting. I should have did this and that. Just push that out of your mind. Don't even start thinking about it until, we get to August, September, when, the scores will start coming out. So you deserve this break. You studied your butt off. You sat the exam. You did more than what a lot of people do. You put yourself out there. So kudos to you. Kudos to every one of you. And for those of you, continuing on with your diploma journey, like D3 coming up, there's a lot of really valuable lessons that you've learned from these units. A lot of times when people do the diploma, you do units 1, viticulture and winemaking, units 2, wine business, and then you do the smaller units of sparkling and fortified because they're a little bit easier and more contained, and then you hit the beast. The D3. And while D3 is a different format, we have one day that's dedicated all to theory and then a second separate day dedicated to tasting versus what you just did in D4, D5 with doing tasting and theory in the same time. There's still lessons that you learn. You've got an idea of some of your tasting approach, some of your time management approach, and some things you did well at and, in your preparation, your studies, and some things you can improve on. Those are really valuable lessons. Nobody can teach you that. We can talk about our experiences. We can talk about, best tips and practices. But until you actually sit down and do it, it's not going to click. So usually when I do these recaps, I have my partner in crime, Noelle, here with me as we talk through this and divide and conquer. But she is busy doing some MW study stuff. She's got a big exam coming up next month, her stage 1 assessment. So everybody starts sending good vibes to her as she gets ready for taking a really huge step. So with that said, and this I know is really short notice, I just posted it on stories like less than an hour ago. But if any of you happen to sit the exams, D4, D5 on Tuesday, and you want to share and talk, chat along with, your experience with that, feel free, do a little request to join. And if I recognize your name, I'll let you in. If I don't recognize your name, I might be a little suspicious. We'll see. You don't have to, because again, short notice. I know not everybody likes to get on camera and talk, but, just a nice chat. Or if you're an MW student floating around there and you're thinking, let's talk about blind tasting. Like I know you are, Yvonne, if you happen to be watching. So with that, I'm going to start talking about the wines. I'm actually going to start with sparkling, D4. And there were some interesting wines here. The feedback that I got from a lot of students that took the exam, including some of our clients that we were coaching for it, is a lot of these wines had, high acidity, traditional method, autolysis notes. And so it's sometimes when you get like all 3 wines that have a lot of those similarities, one was a rosé, but still having that high acidity and those autolysis notes, you get a little nervous. You're like, you want to play mind games. Like, oh no, I can't have 3 traditional method wines. There's got to be a Prosecco here somewhere or a Riesling Sec, tank method. Give me something on it. Avoid mind games as much as you can. You really need to, it's so hard. I know it's, you psych yourself up for it and you're trying to think, what the examiners are doing. You just really got to focus on the glass. And so with that, let's talk about that. And again, if you happen to set the D4 sparkling and you want to join along, just, hit the little request to join icon and we'll see if we can get you on here. But starting with the wines, one of them was from South Africa, a Cape Classique from Klein Constantia. Now this was an interesting one because you think of South Africa, warm climate. Southern hemisphere, overall South Africa is a very warm region. This one area is, you think about the peninsula, the Constantia Peninsula. It juts out into the ocean. So a lot of oceanic influences, that cool Benguela current. This is a cool region of South Africa. So it makes sense that sparkling would come from here. It also makes sense why in your notes, you might not have been getting as ripe of fruit as you expect from a California traditional method, a lot of South African sparkling wines, a lot of Australian sparkling wines outside of Tasmania. You expect to taste more riper fruit. If your little bells were hitting cool climate, this makes sense because of the wind action and the cooling ocean influence. Now, the sparkler was also interesting in that it was 100% Chardonnay. Going back to my comment about the wind, this is actually one of the reasons why you don't find a lot of Pinot Noir on the Constantia Peninsula. Pinot Noir doesn't like wind on it. It gets a little, especially during flowering. Chardonnay is fine. So 100% Chardonnay sparkler, perfect sense here. And also a lot of the notes that you might associate with those riper fruits. That's one of the things that Pinot brings, a little bit more body, along with Meunier, a little bit more fruit. You're straight Chard. So it's all those Chard notes on it. This one spent 38 months aging on lees, so, over 3 years, so a lot of autolysis. So if you're getting those on your notes, even if you didn't go to South Africa, you might have went Champagne. You might have went Franciacorta. Any other traditional method, you would get a lot of overlapping notes there on it. The dosage was about 7 grams per liter, so definitely in that kind of brut range on that dry. And overall, it looked like it was a very good quality wine. And I didn't taste this, so this is just based on looking at the notes, looking at reviews, and getting feedback from other students. I can see myself, especially with that 100% Chardonnay, if I was starting to pick up those notes, thinking Franciacorta, thinking Trento Doc even, more that moderate climate on it. I could definitely see myself going that way. The second wine, the Rosé, was a Champagne. And this was a very interesting one with that. It's a grower-producer, Jacques Picard. I almost wore my Chateau Picard shirt because of this one. Their vineyards for this small grower is in the Montagne de Reims area, but it's actually northeast of Reims. So very cool climate. You think about the textbook and what you're studying, you're learning, okay? The Côte Blanc, Chardonnay. The Vallée de Marne, that's Pinot Meunier. The Montagne de Reims, that's Pinot Noir. In this area, particularly Berru, B-E-R-R-U, this is Chardonnay territory. And this was another sparkler that was dominated by Chardonnay on it. A little bit of Pinot Noir, rosé color. With that, they had some Pinot Noir that was co-fermented in. And then for the color, it was the traditional blending red wine with the white sparkler that you see often with Champagne. They cold soaked the Pinot Noir for that. And so you think cold soaking. Let's go about a sparkling wine. Let's think about with regular wine production. Why are we cold soaking? To get color without getting the tannins. That makes a lot of sense when you think about with sparkling wines. Now, rosés can be a little tough from blind tasting because you have the red wine character with your sparkler. So you have some tannins, even though we're cold soaking to minimize that. And it's hard to kind of get a read. Like it seems from I heard feedback, the quality level of this one was a little tough. In some ways it seemed a little simple with that red fruit there. And sometimes the red fruit can kind of cover up some of the autolysis notes. This particular one spent about 2 years aging on lees. It did have around 30% reserve wine in its non-vintage blend. So that should have upped the quality and give you a little bit more complexity in your notes. But it might not have been screaming in the glass. One of the things I always encourage, especially with the sparkling wine exam, is you got to do what's comfortable for you, but I really don't like for myself the idea of jumping right in the tasting portion for that. I always did the theory portion. I did my little nose notes, did a little bit with nose, then do my theory questions, then came back with the palate, because warming up in the glass and degassing helps a lot with picking up sparkling. And so that may have helped to get some of those more subtle notes. I couldn't find the dosage for this one, but looking at this producer and other wines they had and where I could get dosage feedback, it seemed like this producer likes those really low extra brut to almost brut zero dosage, like a lot of 1 to 2 grams per liter dosage. And that is interesting, especially when I heard the feedback that a lot of folks thought it was a little bit more simple and didn't have, the super complex, tertiary or autolysis notes, even though over 2 years aging, you kind of expect it. If it has a really low dosage, that is such a key component for the Maillard reaction. The sugar from the dosage, that's one of the things that interacts to do those chemical compounds that gets us all those toasty, delicious notes to it. So higher dosage wines will show more of those Maillard reactions. So a lower dosage, really extra brut wine, that makes sense why you might not get those notes on it. But think about the notes and the marks that you did get. You're getting all the red fruit notes there. You're still, especially if it's bringing cool climate, so red fruit, the cool climate from the Chardonnay there, those are notes you're getting. Those are marks you're getting. Nailing the wine is often just a couple of marks. And your logic, even if your conclusion is not the correct conclusion, if your logic makes sense, like here's these cool climate notes, they are sending me to Cremant de Bourgogne with that, or Cremant de Alsace, lovely rosé sparklers there. I think it's a little more simple quality, and so this is why I'm going this area. The examiners will give you marks for that. So again, lots of things you can get from that. The third wine is a favorite of mine. I was kind of excited with this. I don't think I've had this particular vintage, but from Henriot, which is another Chardonnay dominant house. Overall, this flight that you guys got, 100% Chardonnay, Sauv Blanc, a rosé from a very Chardonnay dominant area, and then Henriot was more on that Chardonnay side. Though this one here did have about 46% Pinot Noir, so it wasn't as Chardonnay dominant. But Henriot's style tends to lean more towards Chardonnay. But 2012 vintage, so fruit coming, this is one of their nicer wines. Fruit's coming from a mix of Premier Cru, from the Montagne de Reims, and Grand Cru, especially the Chardonnays from the Côte de Blanc. 6 grams per liter dosage, so extra brut range there, so dry. And then 8 years aging on lees. So probably a lot of tertiary notes came out. It seemed like this one was pretty easy for a lot of folks to be like, yep, this is outstanding champagne. And so if you think about that wine, you have 3 wines there, you probably racked up so many points on that third wine because it seemed like it was very benchmark typical. But even if you didn't do as well as you thought you did, or you would want it to do on the first and second wines, you've got a good bank going on, and you still got those overlapping marks for those other wines. So I'm willing to bet for a lot of folks that were like, when the wines were revealed, like, oh no, I missed this, I missed that. I'm really willing to bet that you probably did a lot better than you expect. So don't think about it till late August, September with that. And with that is Chardonnay. I didn't see any comments there, questions there, but if anybody, again, if you took the Chardonnay exam, Chardonnay exam, might as well have been Chardonnay exam, the sparkling wine exam, and you have your thoughts, feel free to put them in the comments. If you had, your experience and what you thought with the wines, we can circle back to those. But now we're going to move to Fortified, and same invitation that I did before. If anybody's brave, that is sitting out there, that's watching this live, that took the Fortified exam, and you want to join me to talk about your experience, feel free to do a little tap to request, and we'll see if we get you on. But with that, I will continue. The feedback I got for this one is there were some folks that were like, oh, this was a gift. This was awesome. These 3 wines, that they kind of screamed it. And then I had other people that had a very similar reaction that I did when I saw these wines, because there was a lot of similarities to my exam, including a stumbling block that I just tripped right over. Still passed my exam just fine, but I very much empathize with the folks that fell into that same trap I did. So let's get into the Fortified wines. The first one, this is the one that was probably your like yes on it. I don't have the exact wine. It's from Valdespina. It was a Pedro Jimenez. I have another one from a different producer. This was one that was my study wine, and this is, somebody had made the comment, softball wine, and I totally agree with that because this just screams it. Oh, Justin wants to join, so let me get Justin going. PX, because this is a softball, and this is the stickiest damn thing you'll ever see in your life. I mean, just look at that color, clear with the oxidation, and just the sweetness. So hello, Justin.
How are you?
Doing good. How are you feeling?
Pretty good. I thought definitely found the resources that you had provided in the port video. Went back and watched that seminar. That was good. I know we're talking about the first one, which was the PX. again, like, it's one of those wines that's super recognizable. Personally, like, even though it was wine, I did not approach it first.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that that nose was very recognizable, there was going to be a ton of sugar on there. That was
Mm-hmm.
kind of a lesson that I took away from sitting sparkling back in October, was
Mm-hmm.
not to taste in order necessarily, but to sort of like use your nose first.
Yeah.
I also had colleagues that sat that exam as well, and they didn't even taste that one. They wrote a dry tasting note because they really
Wow.
wanted to focus on the difference between wines 2 and 3 on the flight.
So I don't necessarily agree with the idea of not tasting it all and just doing a dry note, but the strategy that you just talked about of, oh, hey, this is probably a sweet wine. Let me focus on these other ones before I just totally just shoot my palate to hell. That
Mm-hmm.
is brilliant. And that is such good feedback for folks that haven't sat these exams yet. Also, when you go to D3, sweet wines can pop up. Take that same approach with that because sweetness is going to change everything in your palate. So really, kudos for that one. But just for those that aren't familiar with PX, because these aren't super popular. I mean, sherry in general you don't find easily, and the sweeter style of sherries are really not popular. So there's probably a good amount of folks that didn't taste this at all before the exam on it. And so just to give you some ideas with this, especially some key notes, this sugar here for the not for my wine, well, actually probably similar to my wine, but for your exam wine, it's been 8 years aging and 420 grams per liter residual sugar. Okay, to put that into context, let's think about our sweet wines we know. Tokai Azu. Those are usually around 120 to 250. And Tokai Azu is usually sweeter than Sauterne. So if Sauterne's your benchmark, we're going sweeter than that. And then we're doubling that pretty much here with this one. I mean, it stains the glass and the sweetness just lingers. And just going to blow it away compared to the others. So yeah, this was your softball. This is the one you racked up a lot of points. But even if you didn't nail it, again, if you weren't familiar, you didn't taste this wine, maybe you went, Malmsey Madeira, the sweeter Madeira. Maybe you went Moscatel, another sweet wine with that, or Rutherglen Muscat. There's going to be quite a few overlapping notes that you would still be getting on. But now
I think
let's get to the trouble parts. Oh, yeah.
this one was quality assessment. I know in some practice sessions that I was in, we talked a little bit about it with quality PX, and that acidity was fairly low, and I think that holds some people back from assessing quality. They're like, "Oh, the acid's low, so I'm going to ding this." But I think one of the things that I heard that was really helpful and interesting was, don't try to make it into something that it's never going to be. Sherry is never going to be a high acid wine.
Yeah.
So, to be able to, in a quality assessment, kind of like ding it because the acidity is, low, I think was really interesting. I landed at a pretty good quality on this one, actually.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
good, outstanding.
Yeah, no, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that makes a lot of sense with what you're saying, especially for those that are trained with the Blick format, firmly ingrained in mind, balance, length, intensity, complexity. So you think balance. Well, I have a lot of sweetness here. What do I need to balance that sweetness? Acid. And so that is a little bit of a trap for you. But what is balancing this in this wine? It's not going to be the acid. In your opinion, what balanced the sweetness of this?
I think I really caught on a very good integration or very well integrated alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
That was there. Also, to the concentration of the fruit flavors, uh,
Mm-hmm.
definitely there. But everything just felt really well stitched together, to be honest, in this wine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, excellent. I mean, alcohol here, a lot of PXs can go in the high range, over 18%. This one, I believe, was 17%, so in that medium range. But yeah, not feeling the burn at all. So it's being balanced by its integration and that concentration. Stickies are always going to be sweet with that. And so we need a little bit of acid there, but you figure you're not going to drink a full glass of this. You're getting this as a little dessert by itself. So your palate is going to get worn out with it, but you can usually get through, a little glass of that. So I would be leaning towards, again, not having tried that particular wine, but with a good quality PX, especially from that good producer, I would be leaning towards it probably being an outstanding wine. I'm sure your tasting note had tons of stuff you picked up. on the nose and the palate, multiple clusters. You know, you had the notes from the drying of the grapes, and then, you know, the aging notes, oxidative. So probably a lot of goodness going on there. So yeah, great comment with that. I appreciate that, Justin. But now let's do the second wines. So 2 ruby ports essentially on that. Different quality levels, different styles. And so some folks were like, yes, I can know this and nailed this. Some folks, again, fell into a trap I did. So I'll let you talk through your experience of the 2 wines, and then I'll talk through what my experience was from the January 2020. Yeah, 2020 feels like forever ago, but it was only January 2020 when I took the exam.
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, when you sort of approach these 2 wines, they have that spirity nose like you typically port. So, you know, you're automatically kind of thinking there that you're in port territory. For me, like, I just sort of like, there was a little bit of a color difference between the 2. Noted them. Definitely, like, and held the 2 glasses up, you saw much richer concentration and depth of color on wine number 3, that single quinta, than you did wine number 2. So definitely that kind of like was one marker for me that we were looking probably at number 3 to be late bottle vintage or possibly vintage. But on the palate, I think there was a lot of differences between these 2. And I kind of got to wonder, you know, if WSET was sort of going for, you know, as you talked about before, like really distinguishing the difference in quality, and really being able to understand that. For me, number 2 on the palate, like, you know, I did hear some people talking, you know, they were in the range of like, this is a older vintage port. But for me, like, I just got so many like fresh, juicy fruit flavors. Have leaned me away from it being an aged vintage port that said, okay, we're probably a bit more of a younger range and a fresher style. Looking at number 3, like number 3 was a 2010, but definitely drank like it was much younger. The tannins were really up there. Number 3, and the concentration, again, there was a very much difference in type of the concentration and depth of the fruit between the 2 ports.
So the wines there, for those that didn't sit the exam and didn't see the release. So wine number 2, it was a basic ruby, but it's from a very good producer, Dow, their fine ruby. So high alcohol, 19%, 3 years aging, like a typical ruby port. The source of the fruit's going to be coming from, you know, kind of a mix of different vineyards, not always their top quality vineyards with that. Residual sugar, 140 grams per liter, so some sweetness. And so the feedback I got from some folks was, you know, maybe it didn't necessarily scream ruby port to them, so they were thinking, or they were looking for like a vin de natural, a Bagnols, you know, a Grenache-based one. So some of the differences there, you mentioned the kind of portiness, that 77% spirit versus the 95.96 or 95 to 96% more neutral spirit. That's a big thing with port that you don't see in vin de naturals. It's not always the easiest to pick up until you're looking for it. And this was a trap that I made. I called, you know, one of my 2 wines vin de natural, basically Bagnols, instead of a port, because I didn't pick up on the spiritiness of the port. Now I know to look for it a lot more, because it does impart its character. Because not only is it not neutral, being only 77%, but they need, when they're fortifying it, especially to fortify it up to high alcohol, they need to pour a whole bunch more of the spirit in there. So versus the higher percent alcohol, 77 to 95.96, you don't have to pour as much to get to that goal that you want. So that character is really big. The residual sugar, the sweetness is also one. It's tough, especially in fortified, because you're already getting your palate weighed down by the alcohol, and then with port tannins. The vin de naturals, they're not as sweet as a lot of people expect them to be. They're still going to be in the sweet category, but the Grenache ones, bases, their minimum is usually around like 45 grams per liter is the minimum. So realistically, they're more like 100 grams versus the ruby ports. Like I mentioned, this one here was 140 grams. So more noticeably sweeter. So this is one that you kind of have to taste side by side. You know, get yourself a Bagnols, get yourself a port. The alcohol level of a Bagnols is going to be less too. You know, they're going to be in the low to medium alcohol range. You know, at 16.4, 16.5% is the cutoff between low and medium. It's usually hovering right around there. So kind of almost a flip between the 2 versus port, always high.
really lucky in studying and doing some lateral tasting the night before. And I the Banyuls right next side to the Ruby Port, and definitely like that was that huge discernible difference in terms of the level of alcohol and how that really played. One of the things that I found too, like in number two, sort of distinguishing two and three and kind of landing in the different styles of port, was how the alcohol played on number two. That I do recall, like, talking a little bit about port and how well that alcohol is integrated. There was definitely a little bit more kind of a burn up on the front part of the palate, whereas in number three, to me, at least that alcohol was coming across much more integrated on number three, which also would be indicative that it's had some age on it and some time for that alcohol to be able to integrate.
Totally. You nailed it quite a bit. With my exam, so my exam in January, I had a Rutherglen Muscat. That was my kind of like PX there. I had a basic Ruby. I think it was Taylor's for mine. And then I had actually a vintage port. I had and who was the vintage producer? Actually, I think I noted it down. Oh, no, I didn't know. But 2016 vintage port, so a young one. And the basic Ruby did for me scream Ruby port, for the exact reason you said. The alcohol, the burn, the spirity was more there. But then you got to three. And three, that gave me a little bit of issues a bit. I saw Kathy made the comment, for her, the tannins of three didn't jump out as much. You're noting the alcohol didn't jump out as much. And so just to backtrack, why number three was a single Quinta, so 2010 vintage, but not necessarily a vintage port. 2010 was a good year. Decanter, their review is, it's uneven, little high yields. It's sandwiched between a really awesome 2009 vintage and 2011 vintage. So not a lot of houses declared 2010, but a lot of good quality producers like Graham's. They have some really good vineyards. This was the Quinto dos Malvados. I apologize for butchering the Portuguese. Prime vineyard in their Cima Corga region. A little bit of altitude, so cooler breezes with the altitude, slows the ripening, extends that growing season, helps build the concentration, and then the utmost care in the winery and in aging to integrate it. Get the tannins will be there for the aging, but really, really well integrated. And it's tough to miss, or it's tough to pick up sometimes on the integration. You're missing it. You're not getting the tannin screaming at you. You're not getting the alcohol screaming at you. And so you're inclined to think, okay, maybe this is a lower alcohol wine, lower tannin wine on it. It's kind of the curse of being good.
Yeah, I ended up, my call was a late bottle vintage for number three. Obviously, it was single Quinta, but definitely, there's going to be a lot of structural overlap there. So, feeling pretty good about that call.
Yeah, we got another comment here that went Banyuls with number three. That's what I did with my vintage port. I also went Banyuls too. There was like a little bit of port quality, but it didn't scream spiritiness. So it sounds like a little similar. And then also, yeah, your palate's going to be super tired, especially if you happen to double do both exams. If you happen to do sparkling earlier in the day and then do fortified, your palate's really tired with that. And it's easy to make that mistake on that. There is a lot of quality. This is going to be an outstanding port, and there's things that the examiners would be looking for to lead you to that. But at the same time, there's parts it's like, it's just not quite port to me. And so you go searching in your brain for another thing, and Banyuls is often easy to fall on. It's tough. I can tell you, I'm getting ready to take my MW interest exams, and so going path Noelle is, I'm going to study the shit out of comparing Banyuls and port Ruby, so I don't make that mistake again. It's that was my bane on it. But kudos to you, Justin, though. I mean, late bottle vintage, you got probably tons of marks with that overlapping, really, really good logic, opportunities to put in your answers. So great job.
And I think they did some gifts on the tasting questions this time. Sometimes there's that, third question or third part of the tasting it all together. That was not there this time.
Okay.
Really kind of surprised me. I kind of was sitting there. I'm like, there's no additional question.
Flipping the page. Always flip the back of the page just to double check.
Get up and ask the proctor, did y'all leave something out? I think one of the things that they did have different on this tasting paper was focusing on identifying the country, the region within the country, and then your justification for that. So I think all together, those three parts were probably about 8 to 10 points on the tasting
Yep.
paper. So they were really wanting to get you there. But I mean, I think with some of the laterals, even if people didn't land on the specific wines that they were, they're going to pick up a lot of structural laterals and be
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. No, you're right. Asking about country and, the region. So few of places in the world make these type of wines. So your world is super small. And so it's really easy to kind of lead to that conclusion and then, have the evidence to point towards that. So you're right that it is. I mean, the examiners do try to be fair. They're really not trying to trick you. There's things they'd like to see you paths to go down. But ultimately, it's all about spreading wine knowledge and, making us all better wine geeks in the world. So thank you, Justin. I really appreciate your help with this, for our subbing in for Noelle with that. Do you have any parting advice for anybody that's going to be watching this in replay, that is studying to prepare for them taking their D4, D5 exams?
I would just say, like, really, study those laterals. Like, to me, I think that's probably one of the most helpful things that I did in the days up to the exam, and kind of like deducing that. I know a couple, I believe the Fortified in October, they had a Rutherglen Muscat on there, and had a colleague who called that a PX when that was on the exam. A lot of overlap structure.
Yep.
Fine. But definitely when you put those two wines side by side, you're getting like that muscatty nose.
Yeah.
You're getting this like raisination like nose out of the PX. So definitely, like, I think it's sometimes I see people like, I'm gonna pour 5 different Madeiras and be able to distinguish like a Cercial from a Rodelo, but to me, the more helpful thing is, can you establish like a Madeira from a port, or can you establish Rutherglen from a PX? That's how
I love that approach, because I'll admit I actually tried to geek out enough to try to determine the difference between those different styles of Madeira, and it's tough. It is. If you have the time to do that, a long runway to your exam, yeah, okay, go for it. But when time's getting closer to the essence, leading up to the exam, doing what it sounds like you did with really focusing on those laterals, that's a great point with that. Another comment Kathy made: practicing the time tasting. Time management's always going to be tough with these exams. 15 minutes kind of max with doing everything, your note and answering it, your logic, your conclusion. If you could try to get that down to 10 minutes, that kind of helps you a little bit with the buffer on that. And so that's something to practice. If you're looking ahead, especially to D3, it's the same thing. Timing's not going to be that different, even though it's 2 separate days from your theory. If you can get really good at doing your notes and conclusions, 10 minutes, you're going to be in a better shape than if you're just taking longer.
Yeah, and I think also, as you're going through the tasting, don't focus on writing a perfect tasting note. Write a tasting note and move on, because definitely, like, the theory section, there were some pretty weighty theory questions. Definitely required some time. Fortunately, I wrapped that up and had about 5 or 10 minutes at the end to go back and refine some of my tasting notes and add a little more detail to them. But I had gotten a lot of points on the table just by in the beginning, getting down what I see, what I know, moving on to the next. I can come back to it later and add more detail.
Excellent. Yeah, great idea. Get those eggs in the basket. Get those points up earlier. Like that. So again, thank you, Justin, very much for being brave. And so with that, I'll let you guys go. Today's Mystery Grape, not as difficult as these fortified and sparkling wines. I think I gave you some easy little clues there, especially towards the end. It's all up on IG stories that you guys can enjoy. And try to guess where I'm going to be next week with that. But Noelle will be back next week, so if anything pops up in the crazy world of wine studies, she'll be your go-to. So you guys take care. Have a good one.